Have you ever looked around and just, I don't know, felt puzzled? Like, we have all this information right at our fingertips,
Yeah, more than ever.
but people seem to hold these wildly different beliefs and they stick to them so
Oh,
hard.
absolutely. And it feels like certain ideas just dominate everything, they cut through all the noise.
Exactly. While other perfectly reasonable ideas just sort of get lost.
Oh, it's a really timely feeling, but it's not a new problem. Thinkers have wrestled with this for ages.
Okay.
That's why today we're doing a deep dive into this fantastic source. It's a lecture from, get this, 1922
Wow.
by the philosopher Bertrand Russell. It's called Free Thought and Official Propaganda.
Bertrand Russell, always pushing boundaries. In 1922, that's right after World War I, isn't it?
Yeah, just a few years later, a time of massive, massive upheaval, socially, politically, everything was changing.
So you can totally see why he'd be thinking hard about freedom and how society actually works.
Definitely. He's looking at this world, trying to pick up the pieces after a huge war, new political systems popping up, mass media starting to, well, become massive.
Mm-hmm.
His ideas are really rooted in that moment, but it's kind of uncanny how much they still resonate.
So our mission today, then, using Russell's lecture as our guide, is to really unpack what he meant by free thought. Because it's maybe not what you'd first expect,
Right. And we want to look at the obstacles he saw. Some of them are pretty surprising.
and explore how societies seem to push us towards being certain instead of, healthily skeptical.
And finally, what did he suggest we do about it? What was his path forward?
And crucially, why does any of this, written almost a century ago, matter to you trying to make sense of the world today?
Exactly. This deep dive is really about using Russell's clarity to help you cut through some of the noise we're all dealing with now.
Okay, let's get into it. Russell starts off asking, well, what even is free thought? And he makes this distinction right away.
Yeah, he does. He talks about a narrow sense and a wide sense.
Okay, the narrow sense is,
That's probably the one people think of first. It's basically not buying into traditional religious beliefs. Not being a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist. Russell himself says he dissents from all known religions.
right, he calls them part of the infancy of human reason. Pretty strong stuff.
It is. He hoped they'd die out. But he's very clear that's not the main point of his lecture. That's the lesser part.
Because the wider sense is the really important one for him.
That's it. The wider sense is thought that's free from, how does he put it, certain kinds of outward control?
Ah, okay. So it's less about the specific belief and more about how you get there, like what's not messing with your thinking process from the outside.
Precisely. What external pressures are off the table?
So what are these outward controls? What does thought need to be free from, according to Russell?
Well, he flags a few things. The first one is maybe the most obvious, historically speaking, legal penalties.
Like actual laws saying you can't think or say certain things.
Exactly. Blasphemy laws are a classic example. He mentions the English ones technically illegal to disbelieve Christianity, though he adds they didn't really enforce it against the rich and powerful.
Convenient.
Isn't it? He also points to things like U.S. entry rules back then. You have to swear you weren't an anarchist or polygamist or communist. Or in Japan, you couldn't question the divinity of the emperor, the Mikado.
He has that great analogy about traveling the world.
Oh, yeah. He says, look, if you're a devout Muslim or a Tolstoyan pacifist or a Bolshevik or even a certain kind of Christian, you'd be breaking the law somewhere on a trip around the globe unless you just kept your mouth shut.
It really paints a picture.
And he makes the point that even though this kind of legal stuff was maybe less common in the West by 1922, it comes from the same place as like the Inquisition. This idea that some opinions are just too dangerous, too monstrous to even allow.
But then he flips it, right? He says these legal penalties, even in his day, weren't the main problem anymore.
Yes. That's such a key insight. He thought other forces were way more effective at controlling thought.
And those were?
The two big ones he really focuses on are economic penalties and the distortion of evidence. Propaganda, basically.
Economic penalties. Just the idea that your opinions could stop you from earning a living. That feels very real.
It does. And Russell wasn't just theorizing. He uses his own life as Exhibit A.
Right. Tell us about that.
Well, his dad appointed free thinkers as guardians in his will, but the courts actually overturned it.
No way.
Yeah, force him into a Christian education. Russell points out the irony. A parent could pump a kid full of any superstition, but couldn't legally appoint guardians to keep them free from superstition.
That's incredible. The state actively enforcing religious conformity.
And it hit his career, too. He was apparently a strong candidate for parliament, a liberal MP seat.
Uh-huh.
But he was turned down. Why? Because he was openly agnostic and wouldn't promise to just, show up at church sometimes for appearances.
So his honesty cost him a potential political career.
Seems like it. The guy who was willing to play along got the seat and had a long career.
And his academic life. Trinity College.
Similar story, they brought him in to lecture, sure, but pointedly not as a fellow. Meaning he had no say in how the place was run, and they could get rid of him easily. He believed it was because the religious faction didn't want an anti-clerical voice having any real power.
And they did dismiss him later, didn't they?
They did in 1916 for his views on the war. Pacifism wasn't popular. They did reappoint him later, but he makes the point very clearly. If he'd been relying on that lectureship to survive, he would have starved.
These aren't small things. This is livelihood being directly threatened by your expressed opinions.
Exactly. And he says it wasn't just about religion. Holding views like communism or free love,
Well,
that was an even bigger handicap professionally back then.
and he contrasted this with Russia at the time.
Right. Where it was flipped. Professing atheism or communism could get you power, while opposing views were silenced. He saw this dangerous situation where you have these opposing societies, both absolutely certain about different sets of, frankly, doubtful ideas, and willing to use economic ruin or state power to enforce them. That, he thought, leads straight to conflict and bitterness.
So economic pressure. A really subtle but powerful way to enforce conformity.
Totally. And the other big one he hammers on is distorting evidence. Propaganda.
And he links it to advertising, which feels incredibly prescient.
Doesn't it? He says, look, modern propaganda learned its tricks from advertisers. People get convinced by just hearing something asserted loudly, and often he mentions a Pear soap ad.
Yeah.
And governments, he says, do the same thing, just with emphasis and a brass band.
And he sees two big problems with propaganda. One is that it appeals to emotion, not reason.
Yeah, the irrational appeal.
Yeah.
But he seems almost more worried about the second problem.
Which is
The massive unfair advantage it gives to the wealthy and powerful.
the amplification effect.
Exactly. He says even if all the arguments were totally logical, if one side can spend £1 million pushing their message and the other side only has 100,000, well, it's not a fair fight, is it?
Not at all.
And the government inherently has this huge advantage. They control so much of the information flow. So for Russell, the core issue isn't just that propaganda uses dodgy tactics, it's the fundamental inequality of opportunity for different ideas to even get a hearing.
So real freedom of thought needs a level playing field for ideas, which laws alone just can't guarantee.
That's his point. The biggest chains aren't necessarily legal ones anymore. They're the economic threats and the way information itself is shaped and controlled by power.
Okay, so if those are the forces blocking free thought, Russell then asks, how do societies end up actively promoting the opposite, this kind of irrational certainty?
Yeah, this is where he really gets into the psychology of belief, and he brings up his famous idea.
The will to doubt.
Exactly. He contrasts it with William James's will to believe. Russell says, no, what we desperately need is the will to doubt. Because, he argues, none of our beliefs are perfectly 100% true. They all have this fuzzy edge, this penumbra of vagueness and error, as he puts it. So the way to get closer to truth isn't to just believe harder. It's to embrace that uncertainty. Hear all sides, look for the facts, be aware of your own biases, and crucially, be willing to ditch your hypothesis if the evidence doesn't support it.
Like science does.
Precisely. He holds up science as the gold standard here. Scientific knowledge is supposed to be tentative, always tested, full of doubt, ready to be updated. He uses Einstein's relativity as an example it was accepted because the evidence pointed that way, even though it upset everything. But even then, scientists saw it as progress, probably not the absolute final word. They have this critical, undogmatic receptiveness.
But then you look at something like politics or religion.
It's the polar opposite, right?
Yeah.
There, having strong, unshakable opinions is often seen as a virtue. It's expected. And those opinions are defended with things much scarier than peer review. Russell mentions starvation, prison, and war. And these dogmas are often deliberately shielded from any real challenge or competing ideas.
And he makes this huge claim, doesn't he?
Yeah.
About what would happen if we just applied a bit more of that scientific skeptical mindset to politics and religion.
He does. It's massive. He says it would cure 9/10 of modern evils.
9/10.
Yeah. War becomes impossible, he thinks. Persecution stops. Education actually starts opening minds instead of closing them. People get jobs based on whether they can actually do them. It's a bold vision based on intellectual humility.
So if doubt is the cure, how do societies manage to pump us so full of this irrational certainty instead?
Well, he points back to those same forces we talked about, education, propaganda, economic pressure, but looks at how they instill certainty.
Okay, let's start with education. He's pretty tough on state schools, isn't he?
Oh, scathing is the word. He argues that the main goal of state elementary education, at least as he saw it, wasn't to develop intelligence. It was just to pour in information without fostering critical thinking.
Ouch. So the goal is pliability, making people easy to manage.
That's his suggestion, making them accept things without asking too many awkward questions. He calls it part of the camouflage of democracy, making things look free while actually relying on, well, deceit in the classroom.
That's a heavy charge. That state education might be about compliance, not thinking.
He backs it up with examples. Like history teaching. Every country's textbook makes their own nation the hero, right? They conveniently forget the bad stuff and twist the facts. He talks about French versus German views of Waterloo, or how British and German books would describe their wars. Always biased.
And that line about American education,
Yep.
making immigrants into good Americans.
Yeah, that's a famous one. He says a good American, just like a good German or a good Japanese citizen produced by that kind of nationalistic education, is pro tanto, meaning to that extent, actually a bad human being.
Why?
Because, he argues, they're trained to unquestioningly believe their nation is the best and deserves unwavering support, a belief that only makes sense inside that nation. He gives this really concrete example from New York state law at the time.
What's that?
It required teachers to prove they were loyal and obedient. They couldn't advocate for any government structure other than the U.S. or New York's. They even had to show they were eager to combat theories of social change.
Wow. So questioning the status quo was literally forbidden for teachers.
Exactly.
Right.
Russell points out that under that rule, figures like Jesus Christ or George Washington would have been fired. They certainly challenged the existing order.
Good point.
He says laws like that force teachers to be either hypocrites or fools. The real danger, he stresses, is the state having this monopoly on young minds, deciding what they hear and don't hear. Officials, he argues, naturally want stability. They want to keep the status quo, keep their power. So genuine intelligence, real critical thinking, just seems awkward to them. They prefer obedience.
It sounds like Plato's guardians, keeping the masses in line.
That's very much the parallel he draws. He also mentions a poet in Soviet Russia, Alexander Blok, being forced to teach aesthetics only from a Marxian point of view. Couldn't publish anything critical, same pattern.
And the Japan example again.
Yeah, he points out Japan was great at teaching literacy, imparting information, but they simultaneously used the schools to promote intense superstition, like worship of the Mikado. He says, we can see that as superstition easily because it's not ours, but we're blind to the national superstitions our own education systems instill.
So step one in building certainty, an education system that prioritizes obedience over inquiry.
That's Russell's take. And then, step two, propaganda kicks in. It takes the people who've come out of that system able to read, but maybe not trained to weigh evidence critically.
And targets them.
Exactly. Using those emotional appeals we talked about, and crucially, leveraging the power of money and influence to make one side of the story seem like the only story or the obvious democratic consensus.
And then economic pressure reinforces it all.
Yep, the modern-day persecution, as he calls it. If holding the wrong opinions means you can't get or keep a job, you learn pretty quickly to keep quiet, or worse, to actually start believing the things that keep you employed. He points to examples ranging from actual starvation in Russia for dissidents like Kropotkin.
Right. To things like professors in America struggling if they dared criticize big corporations like Standard Oil, or the difficulties socialists faced finding work.
And he saw the rise of big companies, monopolies, making this worse.
Definitely. Fewer employers means it's easier to create a blacklist, right?
Yeah.
Easier to make sure anyone who isn't, reliable or subservient just doesn't get hired anywhere important. He saw this trend towards big corporations and state control as a serious threat to liberty, arguing that the old 19th century ideas about freedom weren't enough to deal with it.
Okay, so education molds compliant minds, propaganda shapes their views, and economic pressure keeps them in line. It's a bleak picture.
Yeah.
What's Russell's way out?
He had those two main principles, right?
He did. Principle number one is aimed squarely at education. He says education's fundamental goal needs to change. It should teach people to believe things only when there's some actual reason, some evidence to think they're true.
Combating that credulity head on.
Exactly.
But how do you teach that? It sounds hard.
He has some really neat practical ideas, like teaching kids how to read newspapers critically.
Oh.
Give them, say, accounts of the same historical event from newspapers with totally opposite biases. Then show them the more objective historical record. Teach them how to spot the bias, how to read between the lines, how to guess what really happened by seeing how different sides spin it.
That's clever. Using the problem to create the solution.
Yeah. He says the goal is to cultivate a kind of cynical skepticism, make kids immune to dishonest appeals to their idealism.
Like an inoculation against BS.
Basically, he suggests the same for history. Don't just read the official account. Read the biased primary sources, like Napoleon's own bulletins, and compare them to what actually occurred. Or count how many times the papers falsely reported Lenin was assassinated. He thought that would teach a healthy contempt for lies.
Ah, that's great.
And compare different countries' textbooks about the same war. What does the French book say about a war with England, and vice versa? He argues that kind of exercise is much better citizenship training than just memorizing patriotic slogans.
Because the problem isn't just bad morals. It's also a lack of intelligence specifically, this gullibility that education could fix.
That's his core belief. Intelligence, he thinks, is actually easier to improve than morality, and credulity is the main obstacle.
Okay, so principle 1, fix education to teach critical thinking. What's principle 2?
Principle 2 tackles the economic pressure. Jobs should be given only based on fitness for the work. Period.
Nothing else matters. Not religion, not politics, not personal life.
Nothing. He says considering those things when hiring is the modern form of persecution. It makes legal freedoms meaningless if your opinions mean you starve. He points out that in his time, most people didn't see a problem with, say, not hiring an atheist or a communist. They thought, well, those views are wicked. Of course you wouldn't hire them.
Right, it seemed natural.
But Russell insists people need to realize that in an industrial society where jobs are controlled by others, that attitude is persecution. It kills free thought just as effectively as the Inquisition did.
So how do you safeguard against that?
Public opinion has to change. People need to insist that an employer's control stops at the factory gate or the office door. It has nothing to do with what an employee thinks or believes outside of work.
And he was worried that things like socialism or monopolies could actually make this worse.
Yeah, because they centralize power. Fewer employers means less chance of finding someone who doesn't care about your opinions. He saw the fight for this principle as being just as important as the historical fight for religious freedom.
And he adds that interesting point about maybe needing beliefs to become less intense.
Right. He suggests that maybe the real key to practicing tolerance is when people start to have some doubts about their own absolute certainties. If you're not 100% sure you're right and everyone else is damned, you're probably less likely to, persecute them. A little doubt goes a long way.
It all comes back to that will to doubt.
It really does.
So these two principles, critical education, merit-based jobs, how do we get there? Russell doesn't seem to think it's easy.
No, he's quite realistic. He says it all depends on generating an enlightened public opinion. That's the engine.
And how do you generate that?
Through the efforts of people who actually want it. People like him, writing and speaking, trying to persuade others.
And he wasn't convinced that just changing the economic system, like moving to socialism, would automatically fix the free thought problem.
No, he was skeptical. He thought the trend towards bigger organizations, whether state or private, actually made protecting mental freedom harder, unless public opinion actively pushed back and demanded limits on employer control over beliefs.
So structure matters, but culture and public demand matter more.
That seems to be his view. He muses about educational freedom. Maybe the state only inspects factual teaching, leaving content open. But he admits that might just hand power to organized groups like churches who are more zealous than free thinkers. Still, he says, it would create a space for liberal education if people wanted it enough.
Which leads him to his final big idea, the sort of capstone of the lecture.
Yeah, his plea for the scientific temper.
Not just science itself, but the mindset.
Exactly. Not the results of science. He's very aware those can be used for terrible things like poison gas or the manipulative press. But the temperament, that approach.
The critical thinking, the skepticism, the reliance on evidence, the willingness to be wrong.
That critical, undogmatic receptiveness. He believed that way of thinking, if it could spread beyond the lab into society, could genuinely regenerate humanity, solve our problems. Without it, He feared the destructive power of scientific results could lead to the collapse of civilization.
He saw it as that crucial, a matter of survival.
He really did, a matter of life and death, as he put it for us.
Wow. Okay, so let's try and pull the threads together from this deep dive. Russell's arguing that real free thought isn't just about holding unconventional beliefs. It's about being free from outside control, especially subtle economic pressure and the relentless shaping of information through propaganda.
Right. And he makes a powerful case for the will to doubt, arguing that the dogmatic certainty actively pushed by society through biased education, skewed media, economic fear is the root of so many problems.
And his solutions come down to fundamentally changing education, to prioritize critical thinking, teaching people how to analyze information, how to spot bias, and building a society where your job depends only on your ability, not your private beliefs. Both require a massive shift in public attitude.
And thinking about this from 1922, it's kind of stunning how much those pressures still shape your world, isn't it? The economic incentives to conform, the way money influences the information you see, the debates around what education should really be teaching, the sheer flood of content trying to persuade you.
Yeah, the technology is different. No pair soap ads, maybe, but the underlying dynamics feel incredibly familiar, that constant battle for your attention and belief.
It really does. And think about his final point about tolerance. Russell suggested that maybe tolerance increases when strongly held beliefs start to weaken a bit, when people aren't quite so fiercely certain.
Which is a challenging thought for today. When things often feel so polarized, beliefs seem so intense.
Exactly. So the question Russell leaves us with, maybe, is in your life, in the world you see around you, where is that will to doubt most needed right now? Where could a little less certainty and a little more critical questioning make the biggest difference?